Have you ever seen an entire construction crew abandon a project they swore was impossible, only for one forgotten veteran to walk in and make it work in weeks? That's exactly what happened in the town of Iron Pass, when a failing bridge project nearly cost hundreds of jobs, millions in funding, and the trust of a whole community. But when the foreman called in an old friend from a war zone no one wanted to remember, the impossible became real, and a new kind of strength was revealed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first time anyone heard of Joseph Clay was through whispers, not on job sites, but in veteran circles and truck stop cafes around western Wyoming. He wasn't famous. He didn't want to be. But to those who'd served with him, Joe was the guy you called when everything had gone to hell and nobody else could fix it. He didn't work for prestige or applause. He worked because problems needed solving, and building something out of nothing was the only thing that ever made sense to him. So when Foreman Levi Thorne made a desperate call in the dead of night, with a project teetering on collapse and a deadline approaching like a runaway train, it was Joe who answered. But this isn't where the story begins. To understand how Iron Pass came to depend on a man like Joe, you have to go back a few weeks earlier, when the bridge over Cedar Hollow Creek was already 2 months behind schedule. The crew had tried everything: new materials, revised plans, even bringing in consultants from Cheyenne and Salt Lake. But every fix unraveled the next. The terrain was too unstable, the soil too wet, and the riverbed shifted more than the engineers expected. Cement refused to hold. Steel reinforcements buckled under stress tests. The foundation kept giving way like the land itself was rejecting their efforts. Nothing worked. Tempers flared. One by one, the crew members began transferring out. It wasn't just a work site anymore. It was a graveyard for confidence. Foreman Levi was no slouch. He'd spent 20 years in the industry and had never missed a deadline that wasn't out of his hands. But this job was different. It wasn't just about spanning a gap, it was about keeping a promise. Iron Pass was small, barely more than a dot on the map between two mountain passes. But it had endured decades of economic drought, waiting for its turn to be seen. The bridge wasn't just a structure, it was a lifeline, meant to connect the North Logging Road to the new freight hub near Route 17. Without it, the town would stay in the shadows. With it, supply chains would open, new businesses would come in, and young people might stop leaving. So when the project began to unravel, Levi didn't just feel pressure, he felt shame. The state contract was hanging by a thread. The mayor was losing patience, and the funding board was already talking about reallocating the money elsewhere. Each morning, Levi showed up to the site pretending to believe in miracles, but inside, he knew he was lying to himself. Until one evening, when he sat alone under the temporary floodlights, staring at the cracked pylon, he remembered a face from long ago, a man who once built a crossing under enemy fire using scrap metal, sandbags, and pure will. That night, Levi made the call he'd sworn he'd never have to make. And while Levi waited, the rumors swirled. Some of the younger workers laughed. They called the idea of bringing in an ex-military guy desperate. Said no soldier could solve an engineering problem that had stumped licensed experts and city inspectors. Others, especially the older crew, didn't laugh. They'd heard about Clay. Not specifics, but impressions. Like stories of a ghost who'd show up, fix something that couldn't be fixed, then disappear again. No one knew where he lived. No one had ever seen him on a job site in over a decade. Some said he was retired. Others thought he was dead. So when Joseph Clay arrived that Wednesday morning, he didn't come in with fanfare, no dramatic entrance. Just a beat-up 1988 GMC pickup, mud-caked boots, and a duffel bag full of tools no one had seen in years. He didn't speak much. Just nodded to Levi, walked the site alone for an hour, took notes with a stub of pencil on the back of a cereal box, then sat cross-legged by the main pylon and stared at it like he was listening to it breathe. The rest of the crew didn't know what to do with him. He didn't bark orders. He didn't ask for files. He didn't bring fancy equipment or a team. Just himself. But something about his presence stilled the noise. It wasn't command. It was gravity. Levi didn't explain anything at first. He let Joe operate on instinct. The veteran began showing up at dawn, before anyone else arrived, sketching diagrams in the dirt, tapping on beams with the butt of a wrench, and slowly, day by day, the site started to feel less cursed. The soil tests were retaken. The angle of the supports was recalculated, not with digital models, but with strings, weights, and measurements traced by hand. Joe didn't just know theory. He knew how matter behaved under pressure, and more importantly, how people did too. He didn't scoff at the existing crew or demand compliance. He asked questions. He listened, and when he finally did speak, it was with clarity that cut through the fog of months of confusion. The crew didn't know it yet, but the moment Joe Clay set foot on that site, the bridge had already begun to stand. Before Joseph Clay ever stepped onto that broken construction site in Iron Pass, he was just a name tucked away in the back of Levi Thorne's memory, one of those people who left a permanent mark even after disappearing from your life for decades. But long before he was a veteran or a fixer or someone summoned in desperate moments, he was just Joe. And Joe Clay was never one for crowds, applause, or small talk. He had a quiet way about him that made most people underestimate him at first glance. Average height, lean frame, gray creeping into his dark hair, and a weather-worn face that looked like it had seen every corner of the earth and all its bruises. His eyes, however, were the giveaway. They weren't loud, but they carried something weightier than words, something you noticed if you looked too long. There was a calm in his gaze that only came from standing in chaos and not flinching. He hadn't lived in Iron Pass in years. His cabin was somewhere near the edge of the Bitterroot Range, off a dirt road that didn't appear on most GPS apps. After retiring from the Army as a combat engineer, Joe had spent years drifting between odd jobs, volunteering to rebuild homes in disaster zones, fixing rural water systems in Montana reservations, even helping to rewire generators in flood-prone villages overseas. But he never stayed long in one place. He didn't need to. Joe wasn't interested in being rooted. He was interested in being useful. He had no spouse, no kids, no business card, and no social media. He was a ghost in the digital age. But Levi had kept the number, handwritten in the back of an old address book, and somehow it still worked. The first thing Joe did in Iron Pass was nothing that would impress anyone with a drone or a degree. He didn't roll in with blueprints or laptops. Instead, he walked slowly, methodically, studying the terrain the way a tracker reads the ground. He squatted down and picked up clumps of soil, crumbled them between his fingers, sniffed the air, and stared at the water's current like it was whispering secrets. Most of the crew didn't know what to make of him. To them, he looked like some guy who wandered off a hunting trail with a toolkit. But Levi had known him from another lifetime, and he trusted what he saw, a man whose brain didn't operate in steps. It operated in systems. And once Joe understood a system, he could rebuild it from the foundation up. Joe didn't speak about his past much, but people filled in the gaps with rumors. Some said he once built a makeshift bridge under sniper fire in Kandahar, using abandoned tank parts and reclaimed concrete. Others claimed he'd rescued a platoon by rerouting a blown dam to create a temporary escape path. The truth was probably somewhere in between. But the legend wasn't the point. The point was what Joe could do now, what he still could do, despite the years, the silence, and the scars he carried beneath his long sleeves and faded jeans. He wasn't flashy, but Joe had presence. Not in the way a boss commands attention, but in the way a fire draws people closer on a cold night. The younger workers started noticing the way he paid attention to things they overlooked. Slight shifts in pressure on a beam, the way morning condensation formed differently on steel depending on its stress points, the sound of load distribution echoing up a column when tapped just right. He noticed things no one else did, because he looked in places no one else thought to check. His eyes moved like he was reading a language the rest of the crew hadn't learned. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He didn't lecture, either. He just asked questions. He'd walk up to a welder and ask how long it took for the arc to feel steady on the east side support. He'd hand a junior surveyor a string line and ask where the sag began to look unnatural. In doing so, he gave them agency. Slowly, the crew stopped seeing Joe as an outsider and started seeing him as something else, something in between mentor and mystery. He wasn't there to take over, he was there to help them see the job differently. Levi watched all this unfold with quiet relief. He'd gambled a lot on bringing Joe in, knowing the board would consider it a step backward, trading out modern tech for an old soldier with dirt under his nails and no degree in civil engineering. But Levi didn't need credentials, he needed solutions. And what he saw in Joe's slow, deliberate process was the kind of attention the project had been missing from the start. The original engineers had trusted the models. Joe trusted the earth. Joe's strength wasn't just technical, it was human. He understood fear, especially the kind of fear that crept into a man's spine when he thought he'd failed his town, his team, or his own expectations. He never said it aloud, but the crew began to feel steadier around him. Arguments at the site died down, productivity ticked up. The workers started arriving a little earlier and leaving a little later, not because anyone told them to, but because they believed the project had a chance again. The first time anyone saw Joe smile was when a junior welder named Marcos managed to lay down a perfectly straight weld line on a tension anchor that had been warping for weeks. Joe just nodded, clapped him on the back, and said something about welding like a river runs. Marcos didn't even know what that meant at first, but later that week, when he looked at how the water flowed beneath the temporary scaffolding they'd reinstalled under Joe's guidance, he finally understood. Joe's metaphors were never just metaphors, they were instructions disguised as poetry. The bridge wasn't rising yet, but something else was: morale, focus, unity. The crew didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in months, they believed they had someone who did. And Joe Clay, quiet, weathered, unshakable, was just getting started. The Cedar Hollow site sat on a stretch of wilderness that looked deceptively peaceful, pine-lined hills dipping toward a crooked creek that wound like a vein through the valley. From above, it seemed like a perfect place for a bridge, but anyone who spent more than a week down in the trench knew the land had a mind of its own. It had rained more that season than the previous 4 combined, and the runoff from the hills carried silt, mud, and unpredictability with it. The soil near the banks was loose and rich, great for farming, but terrible for weight-bearing structures. Beneath that was a layer of fractured shale, and below that, in some parts, was nothing but compacted sand and water. The terrain flexed and shifted like it was resisting every bolt and beam laid on it, as if the land had never agreed to be bridged in the first place. The staging area was a mashup of frustration and rusted hope. Steel girders stacked like abandoned promises, cement mixers that groaned with every rotation, and a battered storage trailer filled with half-used blueprints, worn-out gloves, and hard hats with names of workers who'd transferred off the site long ago. The site office had a dry erase board that still bore the original project timeline, a calendar of checkboxes now mostly erased or scratched out. Some days it felt more like a relic of failure than a command center. The porta-johns lined one corner of the site like a warning, and the temporary scaffolding had started to show signs of rot from months of sitting idle in the wet wind. Every corner of the site carried the weight of delay. Even the coffee station under the tarp had lost its scent of hope. Iron Pass itself was only about a 10-minute drive away, a town of no more than 1,200 people nestled in the valley between 2 ridges. It had a post office, 2 diners, a mechanic who doubled as the mayor's cousin, and a bar called the Black Lantern, where most of the crew ended up on Fridays, when they weren't too tired or too disheartened. Main Street was still paved with cracked concrete from the 70s, and the only new building was a gas station with pumps that worked half the time. The town had once been a stopover for logging trucks, but since the mills downsized and the rail yard went dormant, Iron Pass had been slowly fading into memory. The bridge project had stirred the first real sense of movement in years. Local businesses had cleaned their windows, the high school hosted a town meeting about new job prospects, and families started hoping for better commutes and new opportunities. But every missed deadline dimmed that hope. To most of the town, the bridge was just a slab of progress waiting to be realized. But to the workers, it was something far more intimate, a creature they had tried to tame and failed. They spoke about the site like it was cursed. Levi himself had taken to calling it the Hollow's Revenge, half joking, half defeated. The foundation had been poured 3 times already and had to be broken up each time due to slippage and misalignment. The riverbank eroded faster than the supports could set. Pylons leaned out of true within days of being installed, more than one foreman before Levi had quit outright, and Levi had nearly done the same until he remembered Joe. That sense of environmental defiance was not lost on Joe Clay. In fact, it was the first thing he keyed into. He didn't see the bridge as a battle to win, but as a dialogue that had gone ignored. When he walked the site each morning, he wasn't checking for flaws, he was listening. He noticed how the light hit different patches of the creek bed and how the fog rolled in heavier near the east bank. He pointed out to Levi that the water's current split subtly in two just before reaching the central support zone, indicating a subsurface obstruction or ridge shift no one had accounted for. And when he asked if anyone had run a side-scan sonar across the full width of the riverbed, the silence that followed told him everything he needed to know. By the end of his first week, Joe had rearranged the staging layout. Not with fanfare or meetings. He simply began moving equipment and materials to new locations based on wind direction, drainage patterns, and logistical efficiency. Without permission, he rerouted the gravel path that trucks used to access the site, carving a new loop that followed higher ground, reducing slippage and wear. The crew resisted at first, but when deliveries stopped getting stuck and the mix stayed dry through the morning, they stopped questioning. He'd taken the chaos of the site and given it an underlying logic, even if they didn't fully understand how yet. Joe also began to subtly shift the culture of the site itself. He brought a small chalkboard and placed it outside the lunch tent. Every day he wrote a simple quote, some from engineers, some from soldiers, and some that just seemed to come out of nowhere. Strength isn't what resists the storm, it's what learns to bend in the wind. Blueprints are promises. We build with truth. If the ground won't rise for you, you dig until it listens. At first, the guys joked about it, called it Joe's fortune cookie wall, but by the 3rd week someone added a quote of their own, then another. Before long, the chalkboard became a fixture, a space where the crew left each other reminders, observations, even jokes. The environment hadn't changed, but their relationship to it had. And that was Joe's brilliance. He didn't fight the land. He understood that the bridge had to grow from it, not stand over it. He knew that the crew needed to feel like part of that process again, not just laborers but stewards. He pointed out that the problem wasn't just in the soil or the riverbed or the outdated materials. It was in the original assumptions, the arrogant belief that human calculation could override nature without consequence. The engineers had tried to impose a bridge onto the hollow. Joe would build one that belonged to it. The setting, once stubborn and hostile, was beginning to open up, not because it had changed, but because someone finally listened. Cedar Hollow was no longer a battlefield, it was becoming a partner in the build. And with every day Joe walked that ground, he taught the crew how to do the same. Long before Joe Clay arrived at Cedar Hollow, the antagonist wasn't a single person. It was a force, one made of equal parts stubbornness, bureaucracy, ego, and unchecked pride. But if that force had a face, it would have been Gary Maddox. He wasn't the kind of villain you'd find shouting orders from a tower or sabotaging progress for the sake of cruelty. No, Gary was worse. He was the kind of man who believed in data over dirt, paperwork over instinct, and protocol over people. As lead site engineer contracted through the state's Infrastructure Bureau, Gary had been assigned to the Iron Pass Bridge 3 months before the first concrete slab was ever poured. He arrived with a fresh-pressed suit, a briefcase full of spreadsheets, and a smug certainty that the math couldn't be wrong. He believed that if something failed, it wasn't because the numbers lied. It was because the workers didn't follow them properly. Gary had a way of speaking that sounded like he was constantly reading a manual aloud, even when trying to make small talk. He measured success in efficiency ratios, delivery logs, and inspection stamps. To him, the land was an obstacle to be subdued, not studied. He never once knelt to feel the soil or walked the banks at dawn. Instead, he pointed at diagrams, reissued digital schematics, and repeated his favorite phrase, "It's all in the plan." But the more he repeated it, the more the plan collapsed. He doubled down with tighter controls, more surveillance, stricter chain of command lines, and when nothing changed, he started pointing fingers. His disdain for Levi grew quickly. To Gary, Levi's practical experience couldn't possibly outweigh his own certifications and state-backed authority. He referred to him as the cowboy in charge during meetings and made veiled comments about how, quote, field familiarity doesn't replace real engineering. Levi, for his part, had tried to play along. He knew politics when he saw them, and he knew Gary had friends at the Bureau who could make or break contracts. But after months of watching Gary's rigid oversight squeeze the life out of the project, even Levi's patience wore thin. The crew grew resentful. Every failed pour, every flawed support, every bent pylon brought more pressure from Gary's side of the tent, more metrics, more models, more micromanagement. Gary had overseen dozens of projects, mostly in urban centers, and while his resume sparkled, most of his accomplishments were layered in red tape and cost overruns quietly buried in quarterly reports. He didn't build things, he managed them, delegated them, reviewed them from behind safety glass with coffee in hand. So when the terrain of Cedar Hollow defied his assumptions, when the structure refused to conform to his equations, Gary didn't adapt, he insisted. And that insistence became a slow, strangling chokehold on progress. By the time Joe Clay stepped onto the site, Gary had already started drafting a formal request to suspend the project indefinitely. He was preparing a report to recommend reallocating funds to a less geotechnically compromised location 20 miles east. He believed the current site was doomed. He believed the crew was underqualified. Most of all, he believed Levi was out of his depth. What he didn't believe, couldn't fathom, was that someone without a degree, without an official title, without clearance, could walk onto his project and start making progress. So when Gary heard that Levi had brought in an outsider, a veteran no less, he didn't just raise an eyebrow, he raised hell. At the next oversight meeting, Gary didn't waste time. In front of the mayor, the funding board liaison, and the regional project coordinator, he launched into a tirade masked in technical language. He called Joe Clay unauthorized, informally credentialed, and, quote, a liability risk. He questioned Levi's judgment, implied that union regulations might have been violated, and suggested that any further input from non-certified personnel would jeopardize the integrity of the structure and the legality of the contract. His language was sharp, polished, and full of citations from clauses, safety codes, and engineering ethics handbooks. To anyone unfamiliar, it sounded unarguable. But Levi stood his ground. He didn't interrupt. He let Gary talk himself into a righteous fury, then calmly laid out a log of daily improvements made under Joe's quiet guidance. Increased crew morale. Reduced material waste. New soil readings with detailed notes. Adjusted scaffold placement that resulted in fewer delays. Levi had kept records. Not to cover himself, but because Joe had asked for transparency. When Gary demanded proof that any of these methods were valid, Levi handed him hand-drawn diagrams, labeled with measurements, timestamps, and source annotations. Gary scoffed. He called them scribbles, but the funding liaison leaned in. The mayor asked for a copy, and something began to shift. Gary didn't lose power that day, but for the first time his grip loosened. He realized he wasn't just up against Levi anymore. He was up against results. And results are hard to argue with, no matter how shiny the resume or expensive the degree. Still, Gary didn't back down. He turned passive-aggressive. He had his assistants begin inspecting the site more frequently. He required all crew members to log their hours in a new system. He added extra review layers for material approvals, forcing delays. He tried to box Joe out by requiring digital credentials for site access. But each move only exposed how threatened he was and how much the crew no longer respected his control. Joe, for his part, didn't respond to Gary with confrontation. He responded with precision. Every obstacle Gary placed, Joe stepped around. He documented, he adapted, he used the friction as fuel. Joe had dealt with bigger egos in places where mistakes cost lives, not paychecks. Gary was just noise, and in time, the crew learned to tune that noise out. Still, Gary remained a presence, a looming symbol of everything wrong with leadership that forgets the human element. He wasn't just a man. He was the embodiment of the old way, the belief that leadership could be automated, that structure mattered more than soul, and that a bridge could rise on numbers alone. But Gary was about to learn that bridges, like people, only stand when their foundations are built on understanding, and Joe Clay was laying a foundation no storm of red tape could wash away. For weeks before Joe Clay arrived, the Cedar Hollow Bridge site had fallen into a brutal pattern, a ritual of frustration that drained the crew of energy, morale, and belief in the project's future. Each morning began with half-hearted greetings and heavy boots trudging through damp gravel to the staging area. The sun barely had a chance to rise over the hills before the blame started flying. Measurements were off again. Concrete didn't cure right overnight. Support frames had buckled under mild stress tests. Inspectors returned the same verdict: insufficient integrity. So the crew dismantled, adjusted, and rebuilt the same components day after day. It wasn't just exhausting, it was demoralizing. They were no longer building a bridge. They were performing a daily sacrifice to an indifferent force that offered nothing in return. The foreman, Levi Thorne, did his best to shield his men from the weight of impending failure, but even his shoulders weren't wide enough to carry it all. He rotated tasks to keep the monotony at bay, shuffled work crews between east and west anchor zones, and tried to inject optimism into their toolbox talks. But morale doesn't grow in stagnant water, and Levi knew they were waist-deep in it. Crews began to work slower. Mistakes multiplied. Tempers flared between men who used to share beers at the Black Lantern. Every success was temporary. Every fix unraveled the next morning like a cruel reset. It was a cycle so strong it began to feel like fate. At the center of this cycle stood Gary Maddox and his relentless grip on the project plan. Despite repeated failures, he refused to revise the blueprint. He demanded replication instead, forced the bridge into existence through repetition and pressure. He implemented a rigid weekly review structure, during which he berated supervisors and used data charts like courtroom exhibits. But it wasn't just numbers he controlled. He choked the workflow, requiring approvals for even the most basic on-site changes. A crew couldn't move a crane 5 feet without a paper trail. Rebar orders were delayed over procurement signatures. Every adjustment was framed as a deviation from the sacred plan, and every delay blamed on the field teams. The bridge didn't feel like a construction site anymore. It felt like a siege. Into this toxic rhythm stepped Joe Clay, not with grand speeches or a silver bullet solution, but with quiet observation and small, deliberate acts. At first, he didn't break the pattern. He studied it. He walked the same grounds each morning, notepad in hand, listening more than speaking. He watched how the crew moved, where they hesitated, which stations caused the most frustration. He noticed that the tension anchors were always redone on Wednesdays, because that's when the water table rose just enough to affect curing. He noted that the West Bank soil shifted after rain, due to runoff from a tilted storage container upstream. He traced the rituals of failure like a map, and then he began to quietly redraw it. The first thing he altered was timing. He asked Levi to move the anchor pours from midday to dawn, before the sun could bake uneven moisture into the base layers. When questioned, he explained in half a sentence, "The ground's still asleep then." It didn't make sense to Gary, but it worked. Next, he reorganized the rebar delivery so it came in the order the crew needed it, not by batch number. That small change alone saved over an hour a day in sorting and confusion. Then he introduced the mud test, where crew members pressed their boots into the soil at different parts of the site each morning, rating the squish with a simple 1 to 5 system. It sounded ridiculous until it accurately predicted where the trucks would sink later that afternoon. But the biggest change came in the way the crew began to see their own roles. Under Gary's regime, they were treated like cogs, replaceable, voiceless, interchangeable. Under Joe's guidance, they became sensors, observers, participants in the land's language. Joe never told anyone what to do. He asked what they saw, how it felt, what they thought the bridge wanted to do next, and that shift rewired everything. Suddenly, the welder wasn't just a man with a torch. He was the keeper of heat memory, noticing how wind altered flow. The crane operator became a sky reader, adjusting movements based on cloud cover and thermal lift. The soil testers stopped reading numbers alone and started interpreting texture, smell, and moisture, like a baker reading dough. Joe didn't remove the pattern. He revealed the flaws in it and gave the crew permission to rewrite it. That permission was all they needed. They started staying late not because they had to, but because they were chasing breakthroughs. They brought coffee to early shifts and sketched ideas in grease pencil on beams. They laughed more. They argued less. They took ownership of the site again, not as a burden but as a challenge they were willing to meet. Gary, of course, saw these shifts as dangerous. He responded with tighter inspection schedules, demanded daily logs be sent directly to his inbox, and issued warnings to Levi about off-plan practices. But the crew had begun to operate with a new confidence, and confidence is a hard thing to put back in a box. When Gary sent a junior inspector to flag an adjustment Joe made to the frame moldings, the entire crew backed Joe publicly, citing the efficiency and safety improvements. Gary's authority began to look brittle under the weight of actual results. Still, it wasn't smooth sailing. The ritual of failure doesn't disappear overnight. Some habits died hard. Old fears crept back when a temporary beam cracked during a weight test. But instead of panicking, the crew regrouped. Joe walked them through an analysis of what had changed that day, and they discovered a slight shift in barometric pressure had affected the concrete expansion. Joe had predicted it. He just hadn't explained it in time. That mistake became another lesson, not in defeat, but in refinement. Every day after that, the crew began the morning with a 10-minute read. No machines, no metrics, just standing in silence at their assigned zones, sensing the site. Feeling the air, the ground, the way the sounds bounced off the hills. Joe called it listening for the build. And slowly, the ritual changed. It was no longer a pattern of defeat. It was a rhythm of awareness. The bridge wasn't rising yet, but the men were. And in their hands, the impossible started to feel like something worth reaching for again. Cameron hadn't known what to expect when he hired Mason. There was something unpredictable about the veteran. His quiet confidence, his unshakable calm in the middle of chaos. The other men had responded with a mixture of admiration and skepticism, unsure if his military background truly translated to the gritty, unforgiving world of bridge construction. But over the following weeks, Mason's presence shifted everything. He didn't just give orders. He demonstrated, shoulder to shoulder with the crew. When the hydraulic crane jammed during a beam placement, it was Mason who climbed up, inspected the coupling, and directed a makeshift release using nothing more than basic tools and calm instructions. The beam landed perfectly. The men stood in silence, then cheered. That was the first time Cameron saw genuine respect flicker in their eyes for Mason. Not just as a foreman's odd choice, but as a man who got things done. Progress, however, was still slow. The damage from the failed earlier attempts was more extensive than anyone had imagined. Some of the substructures laid by the previous team were completely unusable. Time was bleeding away, and the city officials were becoming restless. Cameron sat in his office trailer one evening, staring at the Gantt chart sprawled across the wall, each delayed milestone mocking him like red flags on a battlefield. He wondered if even Mason's expertise could turn this sinking ship around. That night, Mason entered the trailer without knocking, holding a dog-eared notebook and a pair of blueprints. He laid them out with military precision. "We're going about this wrong," Mason said without waiting for Cameron to speak. "We're following the original plan like it still makes sense, but we need to adapt. This bridge isn't going to be saved by wishful thinking or bureaucratic templates. It's going to be built by reinventing how we do this, with precision, discipline, and cohesion." He proposed a new workflow, something inspired by his time in war zones, where every movement had to be calculated, where supplies were scarce, and failure wasn't just inconvenient, it was fatal. He suggested restructuring the crew into 3 modular teams: foundation, framework, and assembly, each operating semi-independently, but rotating weekly to avoid burnout and improve cross-functional knowledge. He called it the combat rhythm. Cameron hesitated. It was unorthodox. It would take a few days to implement, and time was already against them. But Mason's eyes didn't blink. They didn't waver. There was no ego in his voice, just certainty. Cameron gave him the green light. The next morning, Mason assembled the crew and explained the new plan in plain language. At first, there were groans, pushback, and more than a few sarcastic remarks. But Mason didn't flinch. He answered every question, and when he didn't have an answer, he said so, and found it within the hour. Slowly, the men began to respond. They liked the clarity, they liked knowing their role that week, and they liked being rotated to break the monotony. Tasks that used to take 2 days were completed in 1. For the first time in months, the sound of drills and welders echoed with purpose. Materials stopped going to waste. Mason even implemented end-of-day debriefs, 15-minute gatherings where every crew member could speak up about issues they saw or solutions they had. At first, no one said a word. Then one man mentioned how the platform hoist could be stabilized with an extra clamp. The next day, someone else suggested a shortcut in securing the rebar. Within a week, the team wasn't just building a bridge, they were owning it. It wasn't without setbacks. On a stormy Tuesday, the river surged and washed away 2 days' worth of work. Cameron braced for breakdowns, men throwing their tools, walking off the job. But instead, Mason gathered the crew, reviewed the damages, assigned recovery tasks, and led by example. He waded waist-deep into the mud, tying steel cables and helping haul lost panels from the bank. No one complained. They followed. That night, Cameron watched from his trailer as the crew, soaked and caked in grime, laughed around a barrel fire, sipping from thermoses Mason had brought from his truck. Cameron had never seen morale like this on a site before. The city inspector returned later that week, expecting to find another excuse for delay. Instead, he found synchronized crews, a revised project timeline, and a foreman who didn't look like he took no for an answer. He walked through the site, nodding, muttering to himself. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said as he signed the progress report, with a near-impressed scrawl. Cameron exhaled for the first time in weeks. But deep inside, he knew this wasn't just about completing the bridge anymore. Something bigger was unfolding here. Something about what it meant to rebuild, not just concrete and steel, but trust, grit, and pride. And at the center of it was a man who once diffused bombs in desert towns halfway across the world, now doing the quiet work of restoring purpose in a team of blue-collar builders who had nearly given up. Cameron started to believe they might just finish this, not because the deadline was near, but because they were becoming the kind of crew that refused to fail. The sun rose earlier now, its golden hue spilling over the steel framework like a spotlight on progress. Cameron arrived on site before most mornings. walking through the echoing skeleton of the bridge as birds fluttered between girders and morning mist curled along the river. The rhythmic sound of work had become his new favorite melody, grinders sparking against beams, concrete mixers churning like steady heartbeats, laughter from men who once used to scowl at the very idea of teamwork. It was a strange kind of transformation, almost poetic, and at the heart of it all was Mason. The man had become a fixture, always the first to arrive, last to leave, often caught tightening bolts long after the crews had gone home. But it wasn't just his work ethic that held everything together. It was how he treated the others, with a kind of quiet respect that demanded the same in return. He didn't bark orders, but when he spoke, they listened. And when someone made a mistake, Mason didn't shame them. He pulled them aside, walked them through it, and often showed them how to fix it himself. The men responded not just with discipline, but with loyalty. Cameron noticed the shift most dramatically during a routine safety drill. OSHA required it quarterly, and in the past, it had been a joke. Half-hearted participation, missed checklists, guys rolling their eyes as the foreman ticked boxes on a clipboard. But this time, Mason ran it like a real operation. He staged scenarios with collapsed scaffolding, missing workers, and simulated injuries. The crew split into teams and handled it with the efficiency of a military unit. They took it seriously, not out of fear, but out of pride. When the auditor arrived unannounced 3 days later, he walked away impressed enough to file a commendation. Cameron got the call himself, and for the first time the city's tone was optimistic. The funding delay that had loomed for months was now back on track, thanks to visible progress and newfound confidence in the leadership. But not everything was smooth. Underneath the momentum, cracks still formed, personal ones that the blueprints couldn't predict. One evening, Cameron found Mason sitting alone by the riverbank after hours, his jacket slung over a steel beam and his boots soaked with mud. A cigarette hung between his fingers, burning slowly as he stared at the water. Cameron didn't say anything at first, just sat down beside him and looked out at the same current. Minutes passed before Mason finally spoke, his voice low and steady. He said the silence reminded him of nights overseas, where the wind whispered over the dunes and the only thing louder than the crickets was the sound of your own thoughts. He didn't talk about combat. Not directly. But he said there were days when his hands shook without reason, and nights when he dreamed of people he couldn't save. He'd taken this job not just to work, but to remember who he was when he wasn't wearing a uniform. And sometimes, that meant battling a different kind of enemy, the kind that lived inside, quiet and relentless. Cameron listened. He didn't interrupt. He realized then that this project wasn't just saving the city money or restoring a traffic route. It was giving Mason something to hold on to. A mission, a purpose. And in return, Mason was giving the crew something they didn't know they needed: structure, discipline, and belief in themselves. One of the younger guys, Danny, who used to show up late and half drunk, now arrived early and sober. He'd told Cameron one day, "Mason's the kind of guy you don't want to disappoint." It wasn't fear that kept Danny in line. It was respect. And it was happening to all of them. Welders began inspecting each other's gear before clock-in. Scaffolders double-checked safety rails without being asked. Pride seeped into every task, like mortar between bricks. The bridge itself was beginning to resemble the renderings. Pylons rose like sentinels, cable pathways etched clean lines across the sky, and the central span, once the source of endless setbacks, was now just days from alignment. The mayor had even called Cameron personally, asking if a press tour could be scheduled for the following month. It felt surreal. Not long ago, this project had been a punchline, a money pit of delays and mismanagement. Now it was a symbol of recovery. Mason never basked in the praise. He never even seemed to hear it. When Cameron passed along compliments, Mason would just nod and return to the schedule. But Cameron saw the flicker in his eyes, a quiet satisfaction, like he was slowly stitching together a life he wasn't sure he deserved to reclaim. Then came the complication, One of the engineers flagged a misalignment in the load-bearing joints on the eastern span. It was a minor error on paper, less than a quarter-inch shift, but it could cause major issues under stress. The deadline loomed too close to ignore, and rework would push them back by at least a week. Cameron debated bringing it up to the city, but knew the fallout would be political as much as logistical. He sat in the trailer late that night, running numbers and weighing risks. Mason walked in and saw the worry in his face without asking a thing. He picked up the schematics, studied them, and after a long silence said simply, "We'll fix it. Quietly. Efficiently. No shortcuts." And they did. Over the course of 3 nights, the crew worked in shifts, guided by Mason's flashlight and steely calm. They reinforced joints, realigned supports, and ensured that every bolt was torqued to perfection. By morning, no one would have known a problem existed. It was the kind of solution that required trust, not just in the plan, but in each other. When the sun rose on the 4th day, and the structural inspection passed without a hitch, Cameron stood back and realized this bridge wasn't just a comeback story for the city. It was becoming a monument to something greater: resilience, unity, and the quiet power of one man's ability to lead by doing. For the next several days, the construction site buzzed with an energy it hadn't felt in months. The once muted atmosphere, where disillusionment clung to the air like dust on steel, was replaced by a current of cautious hope. Even the morning light seemed to fall differently on the half-built structure, casting golden edges on the cold concrete, as if nature itself was watching the revival. Stan Harrow didn't march in with dramatic flair or impose authority with barking commands. His presence wasn't about loudness or performance. It was about precision, observation, and action. Every movement he made served a purpose, from how he examined the plans to how he spoke with the crew, always listening first and speaking last. That, in itself, commanded respect. His first move wasn't to criticize the failed foundations or point fingers at those responsible for the collapse. Instead, he sat in the trailer with Glenn, reviewing every drawing, blueprint, soil test, and budget allocation. Glenn, who had been prepared to be defensive or feel undermined, found himself opening up with surprising ease. Stan's calm demeanor and sharp eye made it clear he wasn't here to make anyone look bad. He was here to fix the problem and see the bridge through. "It's not just engineering," Stan had said that morning. "It's systems thinking. The bridge doesn't fail alone. It fails when communication fails, when scheduling breaks down, when people stop seeing their piece as part of the whole." That perspective rippled through Glenn's thoughts like a wake-up call. For the longest time, Glenn had been focused on fixing errors within his scope, bracing the arches, adjusting the beam heights, smoothing over the concrete. But he hadn't stepped back to see the forest from the trees. Stan's analysis was surgical. He pointed out a specific culvert placement that had gone unnoticed by 3 inspectors, but was dangerously close to compromising the water flow dynamics. He noted that a particular mix of concrete was being poured prematurely due to a flawed delivery schedule. But he didn't just notice these things, he corrected them. He talked with the supply company, restructured delivery times, and even redrew minor sections of the foundation schematics, not to show off, but to make the work easier, safer, and more effective for everyone else. More importantly, he won over the crew. It started with a quiet morning when he approached a young welder named Rafi, whose confidence had been shaky since a mistake early in the project had nearly led to a beam misalignment. Instead of berating him or offering unasked-for advice, Stan watched his technique and said, "You've got a good eye. Ever weld in high altitude?" When Rafi replied that he hadn't, Stan nodded and said, "Good. Let's try some stabilization methods today, military style. Might save us a headache come winter." The comment wasn't flattery. It was mentorship. That was Stan's gift. He saw through the layers of doubt and reached people where they needed reassurance the most. Word spread fast through the site. The vet with the eagle eyes was helping people rediscover pride in their craft. Veterans on the team gravitated to him immediately. Civilians followed suit. Suddenly, crews that had worked in fragmented units were pulling together as a single force. They started having lunch in groups again, comparing notes, cross-checking their sections of the bridge. Stan introduced a simple but powerful change. Every morning began with a 10-minute briefing where each lead worker shared one update, one concern, and one solution. It brought transparency, it dissolved blame, and it made people feel heard. Glenn watched all of this unfold with a sense of awe. For weeks he had felt like the foundation was crumbling beneath not just the bridge, but his career. And now, in just days, Stan was helping everyone rebuild something far stronger: trust, not just in each other, but in the work itself. Midweek, an unexpected storm rolled through the valley. Rain pounded the slopes, and wind lashed against the scaffolding like nature was testing their resolve. The previous month, such weather had derailed work completely and exposed more flaws in the structure's stability. But this time, thanks to Stan's revised bracing and site drainage strategies, not only did the bridge hold, it passed a spontaneous safety inspection from the city's engineering consultant. That was the moment when the tide truly turned. The city liaison, a woman named Caroline with a reputation for being hard to impress, actually smiled after her walkthrough. "I don't know what changed here," she said, half smirking, "but this is the first time I've walked this site without seeing a dozen code violations." Glenn didn't respond. He didn't need to. Caroline glanced over her shoulder where Stan was quietly measuring soil retention along the embankment, and her nod was subtle but unmistakable. Stan's reputation was already growing beyond the job site. That night, the team worked a double shift voluntarily, racing against the retreating storm to pour a crucial section of reinforced concrete. No one had asked them to. No one had been promised overtime. They just wanted to get it done. It was more than construction now. It was about proving to themselves that they could rise above the wreckage of failure. And Stan, steady and grounded, was the silent anchor they'd all latched onto. By the time the sun broke through the clouds the next morning, the section was complete. For the first time since the project began, it was ahead of schedule. Glenn stood on the rise looking down at the river, watching the men and women below move with unity, strength, and conviction. He turned to Stan, who had just walked up with a folded set of notes in his hand, always updating, always refining. "What do you think?" Glenn asked. Stan didn't smile, not exactly, but there was a light in his eyes. "We're not just building a bridge anymore," he said. "We're rebuilding what they thought they'd lost." Glenn nodded. Deep down, he knew Stan wasn't just talking about the crew. The following morning, the site was buzzing before dawn. For the first time in weeks, the construction crew arrived early, without being chased by the foreman or threatened with docked pay. The atmosphere, once choked with doubt and discontent, now stirred with quiet resolve. Word had spread quickly about Dale, the veteran who saw more in that bridge than anyone else ever had, and even the most skeptical workers found themselves watching him with growing respect. Dale was already there, standing near the site's schematic board, analyzing every detail with that intense gaze that missed nothing. The foreman, Travis, stood by with a clipboard, looking less like a manager and more like a student. That dynamic had shifted subtly but clearly. Dale was the new lead in spirit, even if no one had officially said it. And strangely, no one minded. The day began with a recalibration of the core support beams. Dale walked the team through the new layout he had sketched from memory the night before. It accounted for the unstable soil along the riverbank and rerouted the load-bearing points to higher ground. The crew, now split into focused teams, set to work following his directions. Dale didn't just delegate, he participated. He was up to his knees in mud, next to the youngest apprentice, pulling ropes and hammering joints. And as the morning sun rose higher, the sound of hammers and drills filled the air, not like before, when it was chaotic and aimless, but now with a rhythm that pulsed with intention. By lunchtime, they had completed what normally took 2 full days. Even Travis had to double-check the numbers, convinced a mistake had been made, but there it was. Progress. Tangible, solid, undeniable. Dale didn't say much during breaks, but when he did speak, it landed with weight. He told stories not to boast, but to teach. He recounted how, during a deployment in Afghanistan, he had to construct a temporary bridge over a flood-ravaged gorge under enemy fire. He explained how materials are only part of the equation. Morale, clarity, and discipline mattered just as much. One of the older welders, who had been threatening to quit the week before, nodded silently, wiping his greasy hands on his pants, the defiance in his shoulders giving way to something like admiration. As the afternoon wore on, a small crisis emerged. A shipment of reinforced steel rods had been delayed due to a paperwork mishap at the depot. The rods were critical for the next phase. Travis panicked, already imagining the mayor's angry phone call and another missed milestone. But Dale remained calm. He reviewed the inventory list, made a quick trip to the storage shed, and returned with a proposal. Using steel mesh and crossbeams from a different phase of the build, they could temporarily reinforce the area and stay on track without compromising safety. It was a clever workaround, not ideal but functional. Travis blinked at him, amazed. No one else would have even thought to try. They implemented the solution within the hour. By the end of the day, even the city inspector, who had dropped by unannounced, walked away nodding in approval. That night, as the crew sat around a makeshift fire pit, they'd set up to warm their hands and unwind. Someone handed Dale a coffee in a chipped thermos. It was a simple gesture, but symbolic. The unspoken sentiment was clear. They trusted him. And maybe, just maybe, they believed in the bridge again. Dale looked around at their faces, grimy, exhausted but proud. And for the first time since he arrived, he allowed himself to feel it too. It wasn't just about completing the structure anymore. It was about restoring faith in the process, in each other, and in the idea that with the right guidance, impossible things could be done. Meanwhile, Travis sat off to the side, reflecting quietly. He had been foreman for almost 8 years, and in all that time, he had never seen such a dramatic shift in morale. He knew it wasn't just about Dale's skills. It was his presence, his ability to lead without ego. Travis felt no jealousy, only a deep, humbling gratitude. Maybe leadership wasn't about barking orders and watching deadlines. It was about understanding people, solving problems under pressure, and inspiring others to be better. That night, Travis wrote an email to his supervisors, giving full credit to Dale and requesting a formal review of the project's revised plan. He didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in weeks, he wasn't dreading the next day. As dawn approached once again, the stars faded over the job site, and something new replaced the hopelessness that had lingered in the air for so long. Momentum. The following week unfolded with a momentum that felt almost unreal to those who had endured the bridge project's sluggish beginnings. Every morning the crew gathered earlier than required, sipping coffee in silence before Dale arrived, subconsciously waiting for his nod, his plan, his clarity. They had all grown used to the sense of order he brought. There was something about how he moved, how he pointed out the smallest misalignments or noticed tension in a rookie's shoulders before it became a mistake. Under his guidance, each task was executed not just with speed, but with care. The foundation beams were now in place, secure and fortified, and they had begun building out the walkway girders, the skeletal structure that would carry not just foot traffic, but the hopes of a town that had almost stopped believing this bridge would ever be finished. Dale had integrated himself seamlessly, but he had also started to draw lines. He refused shortcuts that risked integrity. He halted tasks when measurements didn't match precisely, and he insisted on rest when fatigue made hands sloppy. He knew the price of rushing through the hard parts. Still, there were complications. Weather forecasts showed rainstorms on the horizon, and with the river already swollen from last month's flood, any delay now could undo their recent progress. Travis was on edge, constantly checking his tablet for updates, but Dale reassured him with a steady hand on his shoulder and a reminder they would work with the weather, not against it. That mindset began to influence the entire crew. On the 5th day, as gray clouds rolled in and the first drops started to fall, the team didn't scramble or argue. Instead, they calmly secured the equipment, adjusted the task board for indoor prep work, and set up shop in the tool tent where they prefabricated support joints and waterproofed cables by hand. Dale oversaw every detail, praising quick thinking and steady execution. The storm passed quicker than expected, but left the ground soft and treacherous. The mud made maneuvering heavy equipment a nightmare, and the crane operator, Mitchell, voiced his concerns about stability on the west embankment. Dale didn't dismiss him like others had done in the past. Instead, he had Mitchell walk him through the problem, step by step. Then Dale climbed into the operator's seat himself and demonstrated a new angle of approach, slower and narrower, but far safer. The next hour was a masterclass in precision, as Dale maneuvered steel beams into place with a calm focus that left even Mitchell watching in silent awe. Afterward, Dale handed the controls back and simply said, "You're good, you just needed time." Mitchell would later tell the others that it was the first time someone believed in his instincts. By the weekend, news of their progress had reached City Hall. A local journalist arrived with a camera, asking questions and snapping photos of the crew mid-task. Dale stayed mostly out of frame, pointing the camera instead at the younger workers or at Travis, who nervously gave statements about teamwork and second chances. The article that followed was titled "The Bridge is Rising, and So is Morale," and for the first time in months, the public conversation shifted from skepticism to pride. People started driving by the site just to catch a glimpse. Some even shouted encouragement from their cars. The mayor showed up briefly one afternoon, bringing sandwiches and shaking hands. He didn't say much to Dale, just gave a brief nod as if acknowledging something unspoken. Dale didn't need fanfare, he just wanted the bridge to hold. But not everything was smooth. Late one afternoon, a faulty hydraulic line burst during a lift, dropping a load of metal braces dangerously close to 2 workers. No one was hurt, but the scare rattled everyone. Travis was shaken, pacing and cursing under his breath. Dale pulled him aside and reminded him that panic only spreads faster than fear if a leader lets it. Together they ran a full inspection, found the supplier issue, and reported it. Then Dale gathered the crew, explained what had happened, how it was fixed, and what would be done moving forward. His calm presence once again reset the tone. That night, the workers lingered longer than usual, some of them talking about their families, others about what they planned to do when the bridge was done. It was the first time anyone dared to think of it as a finished thing. Dale sat apart, writing in a worn notebook, sketching ideas and notes, troubleshooting tomorrow before today even ended. The moonlight caught the silver at his temples and the creases at the corners of his eyes, and though he said nothing, his mind was full, not just of steel and schematics, but of memory. Of the men he'd once served with, who never made it home. Of the bridges they built in combat zones, with sweat and sacrifice. This one wasn't life or death, but it mattered in a different way. It was a bridge back to belief, in structure, in resilience, in people coming together for something bigger than themselves. As the lights dimmed and the generators powered down, Dale stood at the edge of the river, looking at the half-built span stretching into the dark. It wasn't finished yet, but it was real, and he would see it through. The next week began with a renewed sense of determination, as if the scare with the hydraulic line had shaken something loose in the crew's collective mindset. They were no longer just building a bridge. They were rebuilding trust in themselves, in each other, and in the value of doing things right. Dale noticed it in the way they moved, in the way they double-checked each other's rigging straps, and reinforced connections without needing to be told. He noticed it in the way Travis no longer hovered nervously, but began making clear decisions, quietly running interference with vendors and city inspectors so that the crew could stay focused. The bridge now had a visible arc, the girders forming a graceful curve that mirrored the river's flow. It was still raw steel and bolts, but the shape was taking hold, undeniable and solid. Dale took his time examining every weld, every tension joint, running his gloved fingers over the seams and nodding without fanfare when the work passed muster. The younger workers watched him closely, taking mental notes, mimicking his techniques with growing confidence. On Tuesday, an older man named Reggie, who had been on light duty due to a back injury, approached Dale and asked if he could shadow him for the day. No specific reason. He just wanted to understand how Dale saw things the way he did. Dale didn't hesitate. He handed Reggie a pair of his spare gloves, slightly worn but still serviceable, and invited him to walk with him from post to post. They moved slowly, not because of Reggie's back, but because Dale explained everything, as if teaching a class. He talked about load distribution, anchor alignment, and how minor temperature shifts could affect tension over time. Reggie nodded often, eyes sharper than they'd been in weeks, and at the end of the day, he told Dale that he hadn't felt this useful since the injury. That night, Travis emailed Dale a list of schedule updates and material orders, followed by a single-line message: "They're all watching you," in a good way. Dale didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew. By Wednesday, the team began installing the base decking, carefully bolting down the support plates that would eventually hold the walking path. The work was precise and physically taxing, requiring each man to stay low and steady while tightening bolts in an exact pattern. Dale assigned 2 younger workers to double-check torque pressure readings, and instead of grumbling about the tedious task, they seemed proud to be trusted. They worked side by side with surprising discipline, the kind usually reserved for more experienced hands. The only problem that day came from a supplier shipment. The wrong grade of weatherproof sealant arrived, and Travis nearly blew a fuse. Dale took one look at the barcode, confirmed the mix ratio didn't match spec, and calmly told the team to shift to auxiliary prep tasks while he made the call to the vendor himself. His voice didn't rise, but it didn't waver either. He was firm, clear, and respectful, and within 20 minutes, a replacement batch was being overnighted. When he hung up, he didn't celebrate. He just went back to work. The team took note. By Thursday, the sun was relentless, turning the steel surfaces blistering hot and draining everyone's energy before noon. But Dale was out there anyway, wearing a sweat-soaked cap and moving beam spacers with bare hands. When Travis tried to order him back under the canopy to rest, Dale waved him off with a half-smile and a shrug. Eventually, the others joined him, not because they were forced to, but because they refused to let the oldest man on site outwork them. That afternoon became a kind of test, and the team passed it together. Later, after sunset, they brought out cold drinks and music from someone's truck stereo, sitting on crates and laughing about small things, childhood injuries, terrible coffee, and the weird quirks of their old supervisors. Dale didn't dominate the conversation, but his stories were always the ones they leaned closer to hear. He spoke of a bridge in Kuwait, built under mortar fire, how the men there worked without blinking, because there was no other option. He spoke not of glory, but of grit, of doing what needed to be done even when no one was watching. That was what stuck with them. Friday came with the promise of city inspectors returning for another round of approvals. The atmosphere was tense, but not panicked. The crew knew their work would hold. Dale arrived early, as usual, already brushing dust off freshly bolted brackets before anyone else had clocked in. When the inspectors came, they brought cameras and clipboards, measuring tools and tired expressions. But this time they left with raised eyebrows and reluctant praise. One even asked Travis, "Where did you find this guy?" To which Travis responded, without hesitation, "He found us." Dale didn't stay to hear it. He was already walking the length of the structure, mentally cataloging what came next. There were still weeks to go, still complications to solve, but for the first time, the crew began to believe not only that the bridge would be finished, but that it would last, longer than they'd planned, better than they'd hoped. That night, as he sat alone in the temporary trailer office, Dale unfolded an old letter, yellowed at the creases, the handwriting faded but still legible. It was from his late wife, written during his last tour, a reminder of why he'd come home in the first place. He read it silently, lips pressed tight, then folded it carefully and tucked it back into his jacket pocket. Outside, the crew's laughter carried through the air like distant music, warm and full of life. Dale leaned back in the chair, his eyes heavy, but his mind alert. There was still more to build, not just the bridge, but the people crossing it. The days that followed were filled with a quiet intensity, the kind that comes when something once broken begins to heal not only in structure but in spirit. The bridge was no longer just a project on paper or a pile of steel and concrete. It was becoming a symbol, an emblem of resilience etched across the river's span. Dale could feel the change in the air each morning as the crew assembled, tools in hand and determination in their eyes. They moved with purpose now, a team rebuilt on the foundation of respect, discipline, and shared pride. Every bolt tightened, every weld inspected with care, echoed a collective promise: this bridge would stand. The city's attention, once skeptical and critical, had softened into admiration and cautious optimism. News crews began scheduling interviews with the foreman and key workers. Local businesses started planning celebrations for the bridge's completion, seeing it as a lifeline for commerce and connectivity. Even the mayor made unannounced visits, shaking hands and praising the progress without the usual political posturing. But for Dale, it wasn't about the accolades or public recognition. It was about the men and women who had once doubted themselves now standing tall beside him, knowing their work mattered. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Dale stood overlooking the bridge's near-completed span. The cool river breeze whispered through the girders, carrying with it a sense of promise. He thought back to the early days, to the frustration and failures, the missed deadlines and mounting pressures. It seemed like a lifetime ago. Now, he saw not just steel and concrete, but the stories of those who had built it, their sweat, their grit, their moments of doubt overcome by sheer will. In the days that followed, Dale took it upon himself to share his story more openly. During breaks, he spoke of his years as a combat engineer, not to boast but to teach the lessons of patience, precision, and the importance of teamwork. He told stories of bridges built under fire, where every mistake could mean disaster, where trust was the currency that held the entire operation together. The crew listened, captivated by the raw honesty and the weight behind his words. For many, these tales were a revelation, proof that the man guiding them had faced far greater challenges and still chose to lead with humility. At the same time, Dale encouraged the younger workers to share their own stories, their struggles, and dreams. He made it clear that every hand that touched the bridge was part of something bigger, a legacy that would outlast them all. Slowly, walls came down. Men who had once been strangers now shared meals and laughter, bonded not just by their labor but by a shared sense of purpose. The city's final inspection loomed, a day that could make or break the entire effort. Dale prepared meticulously, double-checking every joint, every cable, every safety harness. The night before, he gathered the crew for a brief meeting under the glowing lights of the site. Without grand speeches, he simply thanked them for their hard work and reminded them that this was more than a test of engineering. It was a testament to their resilience. When the inspectors arrived, the atmosphere was tense but calm. Cameras rolled, clipboards clicked, and every inch of the bridge was scrutinized. Hours passed like minutes, and then, as the sun climbed higher, the lead inspector approached Dale with a rare smile. The verdict was unanimous. The bridge was sound, safe, and built to last. The crew erupted in quiet cheers, the kind that come from deep relief and hard-won pride. News of the successful inspection spread quickly, and soon the community rallied around the project. A dedication ceremony was planned, inviting city officials, workers' families, and residents. Dale watched as people walked across the finished bridge for the first time, their faces alight with wonder and gratitude. Children raced along the sidewalks, couples strolled hand in hand, and trucks carried goods that would soon fuel local businesses. The bridge was more than infrastructure. It was a lifeline, a promise fulfilled. In the days following the ceremony, Dale found a moment to stand alone on the bridge's midpoint, gazing at the flowing river beneath. He thought of those who had built it with him, their struggles, their triumphs, their quiet moments of doubt turned to determination. He thought of the lessons learned, the friendships forged, and the legacy they had created together. For Dale, the bridge was not just a structure, it was a symbol of transformation. It represented what could be achieved when people came together with trust, respect, and a shared mission. It stood as a reminder that failure was never final, and that even the most daunting challenges could be overcome with grit and heart. As the sun set, casting long shadows over the water, Dale felt a deep sense of peace. The bridge was complete, but its impact would echo far beyond the steel and concrete. It would inspire those who crossed it, reminding them of the power of resilience and the strength found in unity. The legacy of the bridge, and of those who built it, would live on, long after the dust had settled and the last bolt was tightened. It was a testament to the enduring spirit of those who refused to give up, who faced adversity head-on, and who, together, forged a path forward. The morning light crept softly over the horizon, casting a gentle glow across the city and the freshly completed bridge that now stretched confidently across the river. The air carried a crisp freshness, hinting at new beginnings, and the sounds of early commuters mingled with birdsong and the distant hum of awakening industry. The bridge had become more than a physical structure. It was a symbol woven into the daily rhythms of the community, a silent testament to persistence and transformation. From his vantage point on the riverbank, Dale watched as families strolled across the bridge's pedestrian walkways, children running ahead with laughter that seemed to echo off the steel and concrete. Trucks and cars crossed steadily, carrying goods and people whose lives had been touched by the restoration of this vital artery. He reflected on the journey, the rocky start, the near collapse, the doubts, and the breakthrough moments that had changed everything. It was hard to believe how far they had come. The scars of past failures remained etched in the memories of those involved, but they now shared a story of redemption and unity. The bridge was not just a pathway over water, it was a pathway into a renewed future. In the days that followed, word of the project's success spread beyond the city limits. Industry leaders and engineers from neighboring regions sought to learn from the methods Dale and his crew had employed, the blend of military precision, empathetic leadership, and relentless commitment. Dale found himself invited to conferences and panels, where he spoke not only of technical solutions, but of the human element that had fueled their success. He emphasized how trust, respect, and the willingness to listen had been just as critical as the schematics and calculations. These lessons resonated deeply, sparking conversations about leadership, resilience, and the power of second chances. Back in the community, the bridge inspired a wave of local initiatives aimed at renewal. Schools organized field trips to the site, turning it into a living classroom where children could learn about engineering, teamwork, and perseverance. Artists painted murals depicting scenes from the construction, honoring the workers who had poured their sweat and heart into the project. Small businesses began to flourish as access improved and confidence in the city's future grew. Dale, though modest and unassuming, became a quiet pillar in this transformation. He volunteered to mentor young people interested in trades and engineering, sharing his experience and encouraging them to see beyond obstacles to possibilities. The same humility and dedication that had defined his leadership on the site now inspired a new generation to believe in themselves. One afternoon, as Dale walked across the bridge, he noticed a plaque newly installed near the center span. It bore the names of every crew member who had contributed to the project. from the seasoned welders to the apprentices who had learned on the job. Seeing the list, Dale felt a profound sense of connection and pride. This was their legacy, a collective achievement born of shared struggle and unwavering resolve. The bridge stood as a beacon not just of engineering excellence, but of human spirit, resilience, and the transformative power of collaboration. As the sun set that evening, casting a warm golden hue over the river and the city, Dale paused at the edge of the walkway, gazing out at the water flowing beneath. The journey had been arduous and fraught with challenges, but it had culminated in something far greater than a physical crossing. It was a testament to what could be built when people came together, faced their fears, and chose to believe in a better tomorrow. The bridge's legacy would endure, a reminder that failure was not the end, but a stepping stone toward growth, hope, and lasting impact. The days and weeks that followed the bridge's completion rippled through the city in ways no one had fully anticipated. What had begun as a construction project burdened with setbacks and skepticism transformed into a catalyst for broader change, a renewed spirit that touched every corner of the community. People began to see the bridge not merely as a physical structure, but as a metaphor for overcoming obstacles, for building connections where once there were divides. Dale, now a quiet hero among the townspeople, found himself invited to speak at local gatherings, schools, and even the city council. His story of persistence, humility, and leadership resonated deeply with those who faced their own personal challenges. He shared how failure had not been the end of the project, but the beginning of a new approach that valued every voice and every hand involved. His emphasis on teamwork and trust struck a chord, inspiring others to reconsider how they approached their own struggles. Community leaders started looking beyond the bridge itself, initiating programs aimed at fostering collaboration across various sectors: education, business, social services, all motivated by the bridge's symbolism. Local entrepreneurs who once hesitated to invest in the area now found new confidence, spurred on by improved infrastructure and a revitalized public image. Schools incorporated lessons on resilience and problem-solving, using the bridge's story as a real-world example. Dale also began working with vocational programs, mentoring young adults interested in trades, emphasizing the dignity and value of skilled labor. He encouraged them to see that setbacks were not failures, but opportunities to learn and grow stronger. Meanwhile, the bridge itself became a hub for community events, farmers markets, festivals, art installations, all centered around the walkway that connected neighborhoods and lives. The steel and concrete that had once been a symbol of struggle now stood as a beacon of unity and hope. One afternoon, as Dale walked across the bridge with a group of apprentices, he observed their excitement and determination. They asked questions about techniques, materials, and challenges faced during construction. Dale answered patiently, weaving stories of the crew's journey, moments of doubt, teamwork, and breakthrough, imparting not just technical knowledge, but life lessons about perseverance and integrity. The apprentices listened intently, inspired not only by the bridge, but by the man who had helped bring it to life. For Dale, these interactions were as meaningful as the structural triumph itself. He understood that the true legacy of the bridge was not in its steel or span, but in the people it inspired and the community it strengthened. He thought back to the days when the project seemed doomed, when frustration and failure hung heavy in the air. The transformation that followed wasn't just about construction techniques or engineering skill. It was about leadership that nurtured trust, respect, and shared purpose. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the bridge and the city beyond, Dale stood at its center and felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey had been long and hard, marked by challenges that tested every ounce of resolve. But through it all, the bridge endured, and so did the people who built it and the community it served. The lessons learned and the connections forged would carry on, reminding everyone that even in the face of failure, there is always a way forward. The bridge was more than a path over water. It was a testament to human spirit, resilience, and the power of coming together to build something greater than oneself. The story of the bridge did not end with its completion. Rather, it marked the beginning of a legacy that would ripple through the lives of everyone it touched for years to come. The structure stood strong and proud, an enduring monument not only to engineering and craftsmanship, but to the power of resilience, teamwork, and leadership grounded in humility and respect. As time passed, the bridge became woven into the fabric of the community's identity, a daily reminder of what could be achieved when people refused to give up in the face of failure and chose instead to come together with determination and heart. Dale's role, though never seeking the spotlight, became legendary among those who knew the true story. He had brought not only his technical skill, but his life experience, lessons learned in the harshest environments, where failure meant far more than missed deadlines. His ability to lead without ego, to see potential where others saw only problems, had transformed a broken project into a symbol of hope. Years later, young people who had watched the bridge rise from the muddy banks now walked across it with their own dreams and aspirations, inspired by the tales they heard about the foreman who brought a combat engineer veteran to save the day. Dale's mentorship had planted seeds of confidence and pride, encouraging a new generation to pursue skilled trades and leadership roles, knowing that setbacks were simply part of the journey toward success. The city itself changed, growing more vibrant and connected. The bridge facilitated commerce, social interaction, and cultural exchange, knitting together neighborhoods that had once felt isolated and overlooked. It became a gathering place for festivals, markets, and celebrations, reinforcing community bonds and fostering a sense of belonging. The lessons from the bridge project extended far beyond construction sites and city halls. Businesses learned to value collaboration over competition, community groups embraced shared goals over individual agendas, and individuals found strength in unity rather than isolation. Hustles, the narrative of failure turned to triumph, resonated in boardrooms, classrooms, and homes, reminding all who heard it that persistence, adaptability, and trust were keys to overcoming adversity. Dale himself, having quietly retired from active work on the site, continued to give back through volunteer efforts and mentorship programs. He believed deeply that legacy was not about personal glory, but about lifting others up, sharing knowledge, and helping people see their own worth and potential. The bridge stood as his greatest contribution, a tangible, lasting symbol of that belief. As the sun set each evening, casting golden light on the river and the steel span, the bridge seemed to hum with life. It was a living testament to the idea that no matter how daunting the challenge, no matter how many times one might fail, perseverance combined with the right leadership and teamwork could build something enduring and beautiful. This story, born from failure and shaped by courage, continued to inspire those who crossed the bridge and those who dreamed of building bridges in their own lives, whether literal or metaphorical. It was a call to action for all to see setbacks not as endings, but as opportunities to grow, to unite, and to create legacies that endure far beyond the moment. The bridge was more than steel and concrete. It was a beacon of hope, resilience, and the unstoppable power of human spirit. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.